Hello friends, I'm back with another video, and this time I collabed with the amazing Bug.png to create an isopod dragon. Designing critters can be fun, but it's definitely not my greatest strength, so it was really fun to bring someone else's design to life instead. So let's get right into it, starting with a time lapse of this guy's creation. I start with a very long chunk of core wool and roll it up tightly into a snake. Then I wrap the noodle up in some yarn to keep it together and felt all the lumps down into a smoother shape. For most people, it would make sense to wrap the wool around some wire first, but I like making things way harder for myself than they need to be. So I cut open a pathway for the wire and stuff it inside. And then I carefully felt the opening closed. It doesn't have to be perfect since I'll be adding more wool to this later. Now I bulk up the body to almost the correct thickness I want. I can't make it exactly how thick I want it to be because I'll be putting colored wool on top of this later, which adds to the bulk. Onto the head. I roll up a little ball to the proper size, stick a new wire in it, and attach it to the body. Work on building up the shape of the face by adding the snout and cheeks. Next are the patterns. The way I do this is I put the main color down first that appears the most. I don't worry about details like the stripes or the eyes yet, and I'll just put those on top of this yellow. Then I use my disappearing ink marker to draw out where I want the eyes to be. Believe it or not, wool is not a great medium to draw on, so I only use these as a guide to get a rough idea of where the top of the eyes are supposed to go, so that they're about the same size on both sides. After putting the whites of the eyes down, I go back and forth with the white and yellow to refine the lines. And once I'm happy with that, I add in the eye details. For the ears, I felt out a flat shape and felt on the patterns. When making ears, I always make sure that they are big enough on the edges to be folded later. Once I'm happy with the shape, I flatten it out with my hot iron. Use the iron to flatten out the details and shape the face and mouth. Onto the legs. This guy has 8 stumpy little legs, so I just need to use basic shapes for them. I start each of them with little cylinders that taper off towards the ends and then flatten the bottoms of 4 of them, since those are the feet that help him stand. The other 4 I just round off the bottoms of. At the tips of the legs, I also add the little toes in their appropriate colors. After the feet are felted, I stick a wire in each of them so that I can pose them and attach them to the body easier. I don't completely finish the legs before attaching them because I find it's easier to sculpt the shoulders and hips directly onto the body. After the legs are all done, I add the blue to his tummy. isopod-y segments to his back. To do that, I felt on the basic shape and bulk it up to the height I want it to be. Around the edges, I make a flatter piece that wraps around the segments completely. After those are done, I stab many times in a single line to separate the masses into segments, and then do the same to the outer edge. I do the same at the base of his tail, only changing the third segment to yellow instead of purple. Now comes the fur stage, also known as my worst nightmare. This stuff gets everywhere, and it's kind of difficult to groom to a point that looks even remotely presentable. I still need a lot of practice at it, but I think it turned out alright for this little dude. I start at the base of the neck and work up, felting the middle of a strip of roving, then folding it and felting it down. When I get towards the top of the head, I have to take into account the gradient from yellow to orange. To make a more gradual transition, I need to blend the orange and yellow together. To blend the wool together, you put the two colors together and pull them at the ends to separate the fibers, and then overlapping them again. Doing this over and over again will mix the colors together and give you a nice middle point between them. Luckily, these two colors are very close together already, so it didn't take too much work to do. When I get to the face, I only use one layer of wool instead of folding it to give a nice smooth transition from the normal wool to the longer stuff. Before we trim this guy down, we need to comb out the fur because he is bound to get very scrungly with all the touching it had to go through. So I go through and lightly brush out the mats with my needle, as well as position the fur in the direction it needs to go. Now I go through and trim the fur with my curved scissors. I try not to cut too much off at once because I can always cut more off later, but it would be a huge headache to have to redo a section because it ended up too short. I go over the furred bits with a tiny amount of spray glue. This holds the fibers in place just enough so that touching it doesn't turn it into a matted clump. This also lets me stylize the fur a bit more. Finally, to finish off this little guy, I need to make his whiskers. The whiskers have little tufts of fur on the ends, so it's best to start with those first. Add some glue to the end of the wire and take a small clump of wool and twist the ends onto the wire, leaving the end fluffy. Once that's set in place, I add glue down the length of the wire and tightly wrap a longer piece around it. I try my best to keep the thickness as consistent as possible while wrapping it. The tips of the whiskers are blue, and I didn't have the right colored wool, so I'm using chalk pastels for that instead. Then I make little holes in the cheeks for the wires to go into, and I glue the whiskers in place. And with that, this little guy is done.